Yes, I'm going to start. We've divided this up into 4 main sections, and I shall do the first 2, the introduction and the background. And Jane is going to talk a bit more about what is new about the approach. And then we've got a final, just very short piece of our own thoughts and questions that we have at the moment. This is a very new training. We're only in the 2nd year of it. So there's a lot to think about. The work Jane's bit, which is about what is new about the approach, is going to be much more. There's going to be more sort of factual slides, but the first 2 I'm going to just put up some images, just really for to help some imagination, really. So the introduction. I want to start by making it clear that no way are we presenting the work that has been going on in the BJA as any sort of solution to the deep entrenched problems of racism, homophobia and misogyny in our profession. We very much see this as the beginning of work that needs to be collective, sincere and ongoing. We do not offer it as a recipe or a template or as successful in overturning a century of discrimination, supremacy and oppressive power relations. It's an attempt at something, perhaps a different approach, a different focus, which others might find of interest and helpful. As you will have seen, this presentation comes from 2 white, straight, cisgendered women of a certain age, and there may well be questions in people's minds about what authority do we have to speak on such matters. Regarding race, having both studied and written about the white supremacist and colonial aspects of our theory and practice, we were clear there is a very real problem within our psychoanalytic and Jungian analytic institutions, and it needs addressing. Whilst ideally this would be done through collaboration, the reality is that there are very few active members of the organisation who are of colour, and we are anxious not to place too heavy a burden on them. Besides, we suggest it is no good for white people waiting for people of colour to tell us what to do. We have plenty of evidence of how difficult it can be for people of colour to train with us, and we believe it is for we white folk to engage in as deep an examination and exploration of ourselves, our theories and our interactions as we can if we are to move forwards. There are students following this new training who have already been engaging with us in discussions about where they have encountered difficulties, highlighting where we as trainers have let the microaggressions common to racism, homophobia and misogyny go without challenge. They've also pointed out where we've been using European mythological images to illustrate theoretical concepts which can serve to alienate those whose roots are in other cultures. These discussions are proving invaluable, and we very much hope we can move increasingly towards a process of co-construction. I note that quite a few of those trainees are here with us today, and I hope they might join in the discussion later on. Perhaps at this stage, all we can do is make a start, make it clear we know there is a serious problem, and make ourselves as open as possible to the thoughts and responses from others. We are also aware that we are discussing 3 powerful forms of discrimination and imbalances in power relationships within society, those concerning race, gender, and sexuality. Whilst the fact of oppression connects these dynamics, we recognise that the forms they each take are different. This is especially so in psychoanalytic theory and in our institutions. Whilst all have a troubling history in both psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis, Jung wrote some particularly appalling statements about Africans, Asians, and African Americans, and linked these to his theory of the collective unconscious. Freud's position on homosexuality at times is highly controversial and raises questions about his theory of the Oedipus complex. And both view women through a lens fixed in Victorian patriarchy. In each case, we suggest it is not enough to redact these comments from the theory we teach, shrug and call them men of their times. As analysts of the 21st century, we need to examine whether and how such a bias impacts on the concepts themselves, and each decide how this might change our relationship to our founding fathers and those who came after them. A final point, whilst it is Jane and I who are instigators and chairs of this new approach to theory, there are many others who've been very involved from the start in the BJAA, and without whom the project would not have reached this stage. In particular, we'd like to mention Katerina Sarafudu, Georgia Giaccardi, Carol Leader, Stephen Flower, and Serena Wilmot, some of whom are here this evening. The proposal that we take a new approach to teaching theory on our clinical trainings grew out of shifts and dynamics at play in the wider analytic community within our own organisation. Over recent years, there's been a developing number of writers within the analytic community questioning and critiquing the implications for practice of psychotherapy based on unquestioned theoretical concepts rooted in ideas that support white supremacy and colonial endeavours, and in assumptions about gender and sexuality. A feminist critique has a long history, almost since the inception of psychoanalysis, and recent writers, including Young Eisendrath, Benjamin, Orbach, and others. On race, to cite just a few analysts such as Kimball's, Brewster, Van Adams, Brickman, Davids, Dalal, Lowe, Jane, and myself, have interrogated the racist roots of some of our theories and raised concerns for clinical practice. Drescher, Mackenzie, Hartzman, Newbegin, and Giaccardi, amongst many others, have written about psychoanalysis and sexuality. The matter of our profession's shameful history regarding homosexuality has been a subject of much discussion within the BPC. We also know that responses from trainees to primary texts where references to the primitive, the place of women, and attitudes towards homosexuality can be painful and offensive, especially if airbrushed out or left as unquestioned assumptions. Such responses have now been well documented in various research projects, including ones in the then BAP, led by Karen Ciclatera and Nina Foster, which was published in 2012, and the 2014 BPC survey undertaken by the Ethnicity, Culture and Racism Task Group, led by Maxime Dennis. Jane and I had both been involved for a number of years in teaching a few seminars on race and psychotherapy for a number of organisations, often at the end of a long training as a sort of add-on. We were increasingly convinced that a model of few single seminars dealing with race, gender, sexuality as social aspects brought in at the end of training offered a defensive form of tokenism, rather than being front and centre across the whole curriculum. By acting as teachers for such seminars, we felt we were colluding with defensive structures within training organisations that were there to prevent real change. In my book, I discuss how such seminars, as well as the endless discussions concerning how the profession could attract more people of colour to our trainings, were themselves institutional defences. When focused on colour, such conversations tend to concentrate on numbers and appearance, and fail to acknowledge the political nature of racism, thus individualising a structural system, which in turn avoids the matter of supremacy and the privileges we will have to relinquish as white people if things were really to change. We came to see that the key question was, what is it about our profession that is problematic, and what is it we need to address, not in order that we might attract more people of colour, but because it's problematic. Not because others find it problematic, but because it is, and therefore it needs examining, whoever is part of the organisation. On the whole, we felt that attempts to raise the matter had tended to meet the general overarching attitude that there is no problem, or at least not one that necessitates the serious and urgent attention that we think is required, or it's delegated downwards. I'm often asked to speak to trainees in organisations, and on occasions when a presentation is to the whole organisation, it is rare that the senior members turn up. The new developments had some pedigree in work previously undertaken within the BJA to understand individual and institutional racism in a largely white psychoanalytic profession. Way back in 1988, Fahad Dalal had published a highly critical paper in the BJP called Jung, a Racist, which highlights some of the more shocking extracts from Jung's writing on so-called racial differences. Despite this extreme challenge this paper presented to the Jungian community, the response was essentially one of silence, and it was largely ignored for over 25 years. In 2013-14, a group of us in the BJA met in a series of reading groups based around this paper. And in 2015, that group set up a day's internal conference called Picking Up the Gauntlet. This work set an important foundation for what was to come. And the final major factor behind the change was that at that time of our discussions, the BJA as a training organisation was at a very low point. Due to a number of factors, including competition with other similar trainings, few were applying to do the training at the BJA. Whilst there has been now an enormous change in the management of the BPF over the last few years, at that time there was very real frustration with the then management of the organisation, which seemed to thwart possible developments rather than support it. Our energy was low and anxiety was high, and there was a sense that something had to change quite radically. It was a case of one last gasp. Finding we had many concerns in common, Jane and I began to meet in a coffee shop in Finchley Road to share our experience and discuss the problem of what might be done. We are aware that the research showed that there were serious problems in our organisations generally and in the trainings, which went far wider than the teaching of theory. The peculiarity of our profession is that a critical aspect of our trainings takes place individually and privately in the training analysis and to a lesser extent supervision. People are not employed by the institution and are therefore outside of the sort of controls other organisations might have. However, we were aware that most analysts and therapists are interested in theory and in practice. We decided that would be a good place to start. And such a start had to be from inside out, leaning on the thoughtfulness of colleagues and their commitment to change and development. We wanted to discuss concerns about our theory with friends within the organisation to hear how they approach such material. And we decided to invite members of the BJA to join us in forming small reading groups to consider troubling Jungian and Freudian texts concerning race, sexuality, and gender. In recognition of the fact that it was turning to psychosocial studies, which had offered an approach that was extremely helpful on a number of occasions in our thinking, we started by inviting Professor Stephen Frosch from Birkbeck University to engage in a discussion open to all members of the BPF. This set the scene for a series of 6 groups of about 5 or 6 people each in 2019 to 2020, entitled Our Theories Through a Contemporary Lens. Each time, 2 papers on what we considered to be a particularly problematic concept was discussed. There were 2 series of discussions on the same 4 topics: the primitive, inner and outer worlds, contrasexuality, and participation mystique. These were chosen as they were felt to relate to the binary divisions in Western and European thought that underpin the processes of oppression. The readings chosen for each meeting were by authors who critique well-established psychoanalytic terms by engaging with the hierarchical binary divisions on which they are founded. The second series of the reading groups had two main aims. One was to apply thinking around each of the 4 topics to clinical work, and the other was to explore how clinical work could help our thinking around these topics, a sort of two-way process. In each session, a short piece of clinical material relating to the topic was presented within a structure that encouraged free association and exploration of how theory and clinical work are mutually informative. Following a plenary involving all the groups and others who were interested, it was decided to set up a third series to study the foundational concept of individuation in analytical psychology. The aim would be to begin with an introduction, including post-Jungian critique, and then to bring a questioning contemporary lens by considering individuation in relation to sexuality, race, and gender. The final step in our own work, as we prepared to start a new training, were 5 Saturday morning seminars given in 2021 to 22, taught by Caterina Sarafido, called Reading in Context, a creative approach to critical reading, which served as an invaluable foundation for critical evaluation of the theory. In her blurb, she said, having a sense of historical and philosophical context gives unity and system to the analytic body of knowledge and helps us examine critically the grounds of our convictions, prejudice, and beliefs. These seminars help build confidence and cohesion in the initial group of us who were interested in teaching. In our discussions, we didn't always agree, and the major theme was how far we can go in criticising our founding parents, especially Jung. But what was being laid down was a crucial foundation of assumption that the texts are questionable and that it was our responsibility as practicing analysts and teachers to take apart the problematic, explore its roots, and formulate its own positions. I'm going to hand over to Jane now to talk about the approach and what I knew about it. Jane?
Okay, thanks, Helen. Yes, hopefully you've got a really good idea of what's led to this new approach in teaching theory from what Helen's been describing. And my task now is to try to give you a sense of what that looks like on the ground, as it were. It's going to necessarily be brief, but hopefully give you a little bit of detail to give a sense of what we're now doing in our theory teaching programme. Can you do the next slide, please? So I'm going to do this in four parts, 4 headings. I think it's useful just very briefly to sketch some of the key aspects of what went before in terms of our theory programme and what we've to show what we've changed. To say something briefly about redesigning the theory curriculum, particularly from a practical point of view. To say something about the psychosocial and critically evaluative approach. I mean, Helen's covered this pretty much, so it's kind of consolidating something around that. And then finally, kind of what we're learning about the approach to teaching, what's actually emerging in a surprising and interesting way for us as we've just started this new approach. Next slide. So what went before? Really, the main point about this is that we've always had a 4-year theory programme, and in many ways there was nothing wrong with it, in the sense that it was a really solid, good foundation for developmental Jungian. So the theory, it's Jungian thought, but it's also integrated with psychoanalytic thinking, and it's part of a broader programme that includes infant observation and clinical seminars and so on. So in one sense, nothing wrong with it. There were always complaints from teachers and trainees about them being late evening seminars. We had seminars at 8:30 in the evening, difficult time at the end of a long day, people were tired, hard to concentrate. So I think the other aspect about what went before was kind of historically, really, over a long period of time, individuals were asked to come in and teach on particular topics. They would prepare and deliver standalone seminars, maybe 1, 2, 3 seminars, very much doing that in isolation under headings. So what I've put on this slide is some headings from topics that were covered previously. Things like archetypes of the collective unconscious, containment, defenses, borderline states, complex patients, and then headings like addiction, perversion was a heading, trauma, gender, homosexuality, race. So you get the idea that there was the core curriculum, but it was thought about in terms of topics. So the next slide. So redesigning this, the core curriculum was retained, but the approach is different. So rather than thinking in terms of topics, we thought we gathered something together in terms of themes that develop over the 4-year period of the curriculum. And we also moved to a programme that's delivered on a Saturday rather than a late evening seminar. So we have 9 Saturdays per year over 4 years. And within each Saturday, there are 3 theory seminars and a reflective group. So there's a real opportunity for trainees to get to grips with a topic over the whole of the day. And the other major change was from kind of individually delivered topics to forming teaching teams so that the teams plan and deliver training together. So typically for any one of the years of training that's being delivered, there'll be around about 9 to 12 people working on that year with the overall aims of the year in mind. And then from within that group, smaller teams, 2 to 5 people, take the lead on devising reading lists and delivering seminars for each term. But it's a big change for us to be working in that way. This is a broad picture really of the 4 years. I'm not going to go into great detail around this. We're limited in time, but also kind of the focus of this really is something to do with what's new about our programme. And I think the most significant aspect for us from where we're speaking right now is to think about the introductory year, or what we're calling the platform year, and what that consists of. I think it's worth saying though that what we do is that we deliver this platform year, every academic year. So everyone starting a training does that platform year, and then the remaining 3 years are delivered as a rolling programme. So if we move to the next slide. I mean, Helen's covered this pretty much, but I think it's worth emphasising that we are really challenging ourselves to think from a psychosocial point of view, which is a disruption really of a traditional stance of much of analytic theory, which puts the individual first and kind of separately or in a dual relationship with the social. And certainly historically, it's been the tendency of the psychoanalysis to kind of exclude itself from what goes on outside the consulting room. And it's an easy position to get into, and to regard the inner world as the thing that's important. And so it's a real challenge, I think, to that position to begin to think psychosocially. As I said, all trainees begin with the platform year, and the platform year itself begins with an introduction in the autumn term, first term, to the context within which psychoanalysis and analytical psychology emerged. And the idea is that we're really gathering together there some of the learning we did as teachers and as part of the group that we're initiating this new approach. It's the critical thinking, it's the contextualizing that we ourselves were learning about as we prepared for this. And so it lays an important foundation for the trainees too. So the idea is that instead of issues, as it were, of race, gender, sexuality, and so on, previously taught as topics, and as Helen said, typically towards the end of a long training, the aim now is that these are introduced early on and are very much aspects of discussion and critique throughout the 4 years of the curriculum. So the aim is a more joined up experience for trainees, and that links and connections and as well as controversies can be explored throughout the 4 years. And as a broad guide for ourselves when we're planning and delivering the seminars, we have tried to make sure that we cover, certainly in the first seminar or at some point during the day, key concepts relating to whichever theoretical idea is being studied, the key concepts and foundational texts. So trainees are engaging with primary texts, albeit often with difficult aspects that we help them read and critique. And the second seminar then is very much ensuring that current critiques and challenges to the concepts are introduced. And we make sure also that clinical applications are looked at in the third seminar. And then the fourth session is a facilitated reflective group. So encouraging trainees to their reflexivity to think about the positions from which they're reading about the theories and reacting to them, and so on. Okay, could I have the next slide?
Hi.
Thank you. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about the content of the platform year. I just want to kind of highlight something really to give you the flavour of how we're changing the approach by focusing on one particular day in the introductory term. So just to say broadly, in the platform year, trainees are being introduced to the idea of the psyche from a psychoanalytic and Jungian analytic approach, what we mean by psyche, and deepening that understanding to include thinking about the mind-body relationship and Jung's idea of the objective psyche. But in the first term, the aim, could we have the next slide, please, Helen? In the first term, what we're aiming to do in this introductory term is to set the scene, really. So there's a historical and philosophical context for analytical psychology and psychoanalysis. We cover social and political perspectives, and sort of they bracket in the middle of that a day where students are given a kind of bird's eye view, really, of Jung's model of the psyche. So important concepts for analytical psychology are introduced too. So the thing to say about that is that, you know, from the outset, trainees engage with cutting edge and revolutionary aspects of psychoanalysis and Jung's thinking, as well as what's problematic if it's left unquestioned. And it's challenging. I mean, Helen said earlier that, you know, traditionally we would be teaching things like race and racism towards the end of a training. Now we're putting it front and centre right at the beginning. And that's got its own advantages and challenges. The picture that I'm showing there is captures something that one of the trainees said just this last autumn term, which was along the lines of, look, I'm just beginning to build the house here, and you're telling me the foundations are a bit shaky. You know, what am I supposed to do about that? And it's a fair question. It is challenging, I think, early on to be critiquing something that you don't know very much about, and something which you want to feel quite secure about. And I think it's a particular issue maybe for Jungians because, you know, Jungian trainees very often have an idealized transference to Jung, I think. And so it's quite a shock to discover that Jung, Freud, you know, swim in the same water that we all swim in. You know, there's that we in this area have to engage with racism, homophobia, and so on. It's no different. So that can be quite difficult, I think, for trainees. But it's worth saying that, you know, in the seminar that Helen and I teach, which is the social and political perspectives, we are trainees are asked to read. They read the paper that Helen mentioned earlier by Farah Dalal, Young a Racist. We talk about that. They listen to Jack Drescher speaking about at the Psychotherapy Now conference in 2021 about the history of homosexuality in psychoanalysis. They have a chapter from the book that Helen co-authored with Fanny Brewster that examines the prejudicial bias at the roots of Jung's Eurocentric perspective, that it excluded African people and others as lesser or primitive, and that looks at the racism within Freudian and Jungian theory. On the day, they look at Jung's essentialist views on gender, as well as post-Jungian critique of those, and including a reading of Jung as a queer theorist. And we also include readings that engage with this idea of the positive idealizing transference towards Jung and the shattering of that, and how to kind of find something ordinary about engaging with Jung's ideas. And finally, also in response to some feedback from the first platform year day that we taught, we've included an introduction to the post-Jungian idea of cultural complexes. So there's a kind of framework structure for thinking about group experiences and experiences at the level of the group in the individual that involve these powerful feelings and reactions that come in relation to being part of a group that's oppressed, or on the receiving end of a situation of being made other and lesser. Okay, can I have the next slide, please?
Don't know why mine.
Just got 2 more slides really to cover. Excuse me. This is the 4th area I was going to touch on, which is to do with the approach to teaching. And I do think this is an area that we're developing and learning about as we go along, and some interesting things have emerged for us, I think. I'm going to say something in a minute about something that we've built into the structure of the programme for the teachers, which is where at the end of each term we have a review and development morning. We look at the trainee feedback, but we also have a period where we look at our own development. But it's been very interesting to hear in our debriefing meetings that many of the teachers are finding a real shift in the feel of the seminars, a shift to something much more mutual in the discussions than there had been previously. And there's a way of speaking about this, I believe, in the teaching world, which is it's a change from the sage on the stage kind of position to the guide by the side teaching approach. And we're wondering if that's come partly from the teaching team's approach, but also perhaps from our own openness to questioning and critiquing, valued ideas that we've lived with and been wedded to for a long time. That kind of questioning in ourselves may well be helping us to teach in a different way. I think another factor is that because of the way we've set up the training, we've got a number of different groups that come together to do the theory programme. And they've got a range of experience and backgrounds. So there are those who are just beginning a once weekly psychotherapy training who won't have had very much experience clinically. Others who will have had a lot more experience, who are doing the analytic training or doing a modified version of that. And then we also have a group who are doing the child and adolescent psychotherapy training who have a particular interest in Jungian ideas. And so they also bring another perspective from their work, principally in the National Health Service and with children. And another really interesting phenomenon, I don't really know how to think about this. There may be many ways to think about this. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about it too. That Jungian thinking has become more central, I think, to our programme. It's always been there, and it's always been, as I said earlier on, something that's integrated with psychoanalytic thinking because we're developmental Jungians. But this ongoing work to integrate Jung has really resulted in something which is like a kind of increased presence and confidence in working with Jungian ideas. And we certainly benefit from the academic knowledge and depth reading of Jung that Katerina brings. And this includes integrating some of Jung's recently published work for the first time, which is very exciting and interesting. And we can come at that with our critical minds. It's very interesting. So what is that? Is it defensive, or are we becoming more Jungian because we feel a bit threatened? I don't think it's that, actually, not entirely anyway. There is certainly a shift and perhaps it's a power dynamic, to do with the place of Jung in relation to psychoanalysis that traditionally may be more marginalized, but there's sort of more confidence now, I think. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So my final slide is just to say something a little bit more about the review and development meetings, because I hope it's coming across that we really are in a position of learning ourselves, not at all wanting to be thought of as being experts, but a lot of this is new and challenging for us too. So this review at the end of each term, we've had 1, 2, 3, 4 of those so far, and as well as reviewing the teaching and the trainee feedback, we open up an area for our own learning, really, and our own reflection. Sometimes papers contributed by members of the groups, or sometimes other papers that we might read to help with the discussion. So we began with a reflective paper by Giorgio Gicardi, which was a real question about how radical we might be in this new space for critical thinking around cultural assumptions and normativity and power and universality, thinking about clinical concepts and techniques. It's also a place where we can help each other to pre-digest, to explore areas and difficult debates, things that we ourselves might not have thought very much about. Certainly there was something very live around transgender identities in our second meeting, which was very helpful for us to explore together. The third one, we looked at teaching with the psychosocial, drawing on papers by Noreen Giffney and Lawrence Sperling. And then the final one that we've had most recently has come out of feedback from trainees about disappointment, really, in the teachers' struggles to respond to some microaggressions in relation to racism and homophobia. And, again, a real opportunity for us as teachers to think about that, try and learn from what had happened. So, final thoughts. Helen and I are just going to end with a few thoughts and questions before the discussion time.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, we do a lot of thinking and talking about where we're going and what's happening, and how easily defensive structures build in this system. The first one we just have got 4 really main questions that we've been thinking about. The first one is, as I said, we decided to focus on theory and the teaching of theory, but of course that's only one part of a very complex training for people. We are hoping that the work that the teachers we are doing as teachers on ourselves, on our own thinking, is sort of the reverberating out within the organization. So it's a sort of bottom up rather than a top down process. And we hope that the focus on the racist, heteronormative and misogynistic aspects of a theory will lead to something deeper happening in all the other aspects of the training. We also, the the leaders of the infant observation, the clinical seminars, the reflective groups, all the different parts of the training are invited to those review and development mornings, and most of them attend, and I think find them helpful. But it may be that we've made a silo out of the theory and the theory teaching, and we're only scratching the surface. We hope it's a credible start and there will have impacts out, but it's a question for us. Jane?
Yes, the other ongoing question is related to how to maintain and how to develop the ethos that we've begun with this new approach. In one way, there was, you might say, there was only a section of the organisation, the BJAA, that took part in the reading groups that Helen mentioned earlier on. But actually, in our Finchley Road coffee shop discussions, or moments of doom sometimes, you know, there was oh gosh, can we keep going with this? Will there be any interest? You know, is there going to be just a kind of sigh of sort of apathy, really, in relation to, you know, yet another event that's to do with institutional racism and so on? And actually, the interest that there was amongst colleagues in talking about, you know, foundational ideas like the primitive was really surprising and pleasantly surprising, the number of people who were interested and actively wanting to be part of it. So that was encouraging. But there is a question, you know, as new teachers come in, as we go forward with the 4 years of the training, they won't be people who were there at the beginning with the same kind of level of sort of kind of excitement and newness. And how do we keep that going? That's a big question that's around.
That relates to the third point, I think, which is about how do we keep the system open. It feels like this innovation, the change in the training, has really opened up the BJA quite a lot. There's a general excitement around, I think. I think people are putting in a huge amount of work in preparing for the trainings and developing new reading lists, etc. And working in these teams. It's taking a lot of energy and a lot of work, but the feedback we're getting and is being discussed is that people are really enjoying it and finding it quite exciting. We're very, very far away from the doldrums that we were in a couple of years ago, at least in this area. But it's you know, we know from systems theory that all systems tend towards closure. It is something about how do we keep the system open, or how is the system kept open, and it may well not be us who needs to be doing that. Yeah, that's one of our questions.
At which point?
Yeah.
Hold on,
sorry.
one more.
Can I say one final thing, Jean?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Briefly. I mean, it's related to what Helen's just said. It's the final point on the screen there. And it's this really deeply uncomfortable question that we sit with all the time, really. You know, is this something really radical, exciting, different that can be taken forward? Maybe not by us, but, you know, in some way, have we made a really good start on something? Or are we doing something that's kind of reinforcing the defences against real change? And it's a deeply difficult and uncomfortable place, but really important to stay with that question, I think. Helen pointed out to me the book title by Audre Lorde, which is a question really, that, you know, can the master's tools demolish the master's house? Or actually it's a statement, the master's tools cannot demolish the master's house. So are we necessarily limited in what we can do? But very important that we keep asking ourselves that question.